actually, this isn't necessarily a bad section to miss, for them to miss. Because if you've read it, there's a lot of pause and tails going on. Still, these miracles that Elisha has wrought. Although he is going to fulfill one of those checklists that Elijah had before he passed. So we're in the Elisha stories, and Elisha, just sort of get a running start. How does Elisha become a prophet? How does Elisha become a prophet?
Anointed by Elijah.
Okay, Elijah anoints him. That's one of the things Elijah is told to do. And what's the circumstance around him becoming this prophet? What was the circumstance? Because it was a unique kind of circumstance. Because Elijah calls him and he's following him. And what occurs that indicates that Elisha is going to continue?
When Elijah was taken up, Elisha asked to be blessed with Elijah's blessings.
Okay, right. And he talks about a double share, which is the share that the eldest son would receive, so that he would become sort of the inheritor, the heir of Elijah, his work. And Elisha not only sees him taken up, but what does Elisha receive as Elijah is taken up? Which becomes kind of interesting.
Didn't he pick up his clothes?
Yeah, he gets the mantle,
Yeah.
so he ends up inheriting that, sort of becomes the symbolic. He becomes not only the heir of Elijah, but symbolically represented by him taking up the cloak, taking up the mantle, and continuing. And what are some of the things that Elisha has done to validate his position?
Instructed the one gal to pour the oil. Her husband had passed, and she needed to be able to support herself, so she sold the oil.
Okay, which was very similar to another story that was Elijah's story, where he had the inexhaustible jar of oil and basket or container of flour. Okay, so we've got that. What else has he done that's kind of validated his ministry, his mission? Because we're gonna hear one of the stories in what we're looking at today.
He healed a boy.
Okay, he healed a boy. In fact, he brought him back to life. And did it in a very dramatic way, which is again something that Elijah had done. It's interesting as you read these stories as Christians later, looking back. You've got these two prophets, Elijah and Elisha, and we would tend to emphasize. Most Christians would know about Elijah, but not Elisha. And yet when you look at the stories, Elisha he does a lot more. There's a lot more material on him in the book of Kings than the other, which is kind of interesting. So from their perspective, it may be a little different from ours, because Elijah is so associated with the end. That he's going to return at the end of time to sort of usher in the general resurrection. Since that's so much a part of Christian theology, he becomes far more important as a figure. But as we look at the history of Israel, the figure of Elisha is really, really important. In fact, Elijah is given 3 things to do. God gives Elijah 3 things to do. And you remember what those 3 things
The first was to appoint
The first is to appoint Elisha, and remember he was walking behind the ox, and he was told to leave the oxen behind and go follow. And what were the other two?
appoint 2 kings.
Okay, it was going to be 2 kings, and what were the 2 kings? Because we're talking about 2 kingdoms, right? The Israel has divided after Solomon into 2 kingdoms, and so we've got the kingdom of, what were the 2 kingdoms that came from Solomon's united kingdom?
Israel and Judah.
Okay, Israel and Judah. You got Israel and Judah. So when appointing 2 kings, you'd assume that one would be king of Israel and the other one would be king of Judah, but that's not it, right? So who did God tell Elijah to anoint as king? Jehu will be king of Israel, which is kind of dramatic because he's going to be from another family. So one of the things we've seen with Israel is they go through dynasties, go through families. And so one family falls and then you have another family. And usually it's, military or some kind of civil war or rebellion, and you have the turnover. You don't have that in Judah because the kings of Judah are all coming from the Davidic line. So they're all in the line of David, but that's not the case with the kings of Israel. In fact, the king of Israel now, Joram, is the descendant of Ahab, which is a descendant of Omri, so that's his dynasty. He's going to appoint a new one, which will represent a new family, Jehu. So that's one. Who's the other king?
Was the country Aram?
Okay, Aram. And Aram, this is going to be Hazael. And again, I've told you, whenever you see El at the end of a name, it's somehow associated with God because that's a Semitic name for God, is just a generic name for God, is El. So Hazael is going to become king of Aram. And Aram is where Syria is now, centered on the city of Damascus. Really, something interesting historically is going on here. And this is outside of what's happening in the Chronicles, what's happening in the writings of 2nd Kings. Right now there's a little bit of a power vacuum because we've got there are 2 dominant powers in this Fertile Crescent and in the Middle East. One, and when you look at ancient civilizations, they are almost always centered on rivers because that's where land is most fertile. So if you need agriculture to support any kind of civilization, particularly urban civilization. You're going to need a lot of food to eat. And so you tend to have these civilizations centered around rivers. And one major river is the Nile. And what civilization centers around the Nile? What is the ancient civilization that is Nile-centered? Yeah, the Egyptian. So Egypt is centered in the Nile because there's plenty of food, and when you got food, then you can have people in cities making tools, specialization of labor that you can't have if everybody is just trying to survive. So that's happened. So you have Egypt as a major center because you're centered around the Nile River. And you've got 2 other rivers that are further east, the Tigris and Euphrates River, which is now where Iraq is now, between the Tigris and Euphrates. And that's really fertile. You got 2 rivers. So you have a lot of agriculture there, and that becomes another power center. The difference is the civilizations in the Tigris Euphrates tend to change. You have it's a bigger area, so you have different peoples that rise. And these different peoples will sort of dominate this area, not always the same. And when one people ends up dominating this area, then it becomes a major power. And so what we end up right now, and I'll only mention it because we've got Israel and Aram in constant warfare. And Israel and Aram, they're in between these two major civilizations. Now, there's no river running through there. So you got an immediate problem in Palestine and Syria because you don't have a lot of water. So you don't have a huge amount of agriculture. So the power is to the west in Egypt and to the east, Mesopotamia. And so you've got this kind of power vacuum where we've got these two kingdoms. And Solomon enjoyed it too. That's why he could rise to power, because you didn't have major powers on the east and the west. What we're going to see is that's going to change really soon, because we're having a people rise in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates that's going to cause a lot of problem for Israel and Judah and Aram and Moab and Edom and Ammon, all those little kingdoms that are caught in between. They're constantly being pressured by the Egyptians and being pressured by the people of Mesopotamia because they're the powers. We're going to see one rise in Mesopotamia that's going to cause a lot of problems. We're close, but not there yet. That's why we've got a lot of conflict in this area in between the two, because right now Egypt and Mesopotamia aren't particularly well organized or strong. So it allows the kingdoms in between to sort of exert some influence. It's also nice to be in the middle because trade routes are going through. So anyway, that's kind of historically what's going on. He doesn't talk about it because the focus of the writer of Kings is what? Who is driving the story in Kings? Who is the one that is really driving this story? God is. So it's not Egypt, it's not Mesopotamia. He's not giving objective history. God is driving the story. So what happens because of God. That's what he's writing. And that's kind of what we've got as we enter into chapter 6. Now, so we've got these three things. We got three things given to Elijah. We got two of them that haven't been done yet that will be done by his heir, by Elisha. Now, as we enter chapter 6, who approaches? We've got, what figure is right there at the beginning of chapter 6?
Elisha.
Okay, we got Elisha. And who is there with Elisha? Who approaches him? Okay, a company of prophets. And we've seen a company of prophets before, right? And what role have they tended to play in the story? In other stories that we've looked at, because they don't specify how many, they don't mention any names in the group. It's just called a company of prophets, has shown up in different places. What have they tended to do when they've shown up? Yeah, they've tended to advise. They haven't been integral to the story. They haven't been sort of the center. They're sort of on the periphery giving information. And they really kind of handled as like a person. You know, this company of prophets sort of speaks as one, almost like a chorus that will speak. So it shows up, and the writer tends to use them to advance the story. Like you need a third, a person to show up, but instead of a person, you have this company because they all seem to have the same view. Okay, so he's approached by this company of prophets, and what's their situation?
I didn't read this. I read the ones before. I missed 2 weeks. So
Okay.
I thought we were going on 3 through 5.
Oh, yeah, we did that.
I already did that.
So-
Okay. All right. I'm looking.
Okay, well, so what we'll do is we'll just pause and wait for you to... No, that would be terrible.
All right. I didn't read that. I read the others, but I didn't read this yet.
Okay, so we've got this company of prophets. It's really a pretty mundane situation, isn't it?
They wanted a place to worship.
Yeah,
Too small.
Yeah, where they are is too small, so they need a bigger place, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what does Elisha do? What is his advice? Is this company speaking as one says we need a bigger place? Elisha says,
Go build it.
go build it. And what do they start doing?
They went to the Jordan and started cutting.
Yeah, they
down
start
trees.
cutting down trees and to build it. Now, as they're cutting down these trees to build this new, bigger, whatever, what happens?
The iron axe head fell into the water.
Okay, as he's chopping, a guy is chopping, the head of the axe goes into the water. Now, why is that a problem?
Because it's gonna sink, and you need that.
It's going to sink. You're going to need it. Also shows culturally that the axe head is made of iron, and that's really valuable. Because this is a big issue that this axe head has now sunk to the bottom of the Jordan, and even the guy says with this axe,
It was borrowed.
yeah, it's not even mine. And so what ends up happening with the axe head?
The man of God asked where did it fall, and they showed him the place. Elisha got a stick and threw it there, and the iron.
And the iron floats to the top. Now, what? And then the story ends. And we never hear about these prophets, and we never hear about what they build, and we never. So this story is sort of independent. It starts and finishes and isn't referred back. So what's the purpose? Why is the writer including this relatively mundane story about guys building a new building and this deal with the axe head? Why is he putting this in here? Why do you think he included this?
Because it showed faith.
Okay, it's showing faith. What else is it showing?
God's with Elisha.
Okay, there's no question that Elisha has power, has authority, that he's able to do this. So we've got this another miracle. And why would that be important that the writer wants to keep on reminding us that Elisha has authority?
Because God's in control.
Okay, because God is controlled and it's working through Elisha. And in fact, he's going to work through Elisha now, right? Because after the deal with the axe head, which like I said, just kind of drops in there, what's the situation? The situation changes drastically in verse 8, right? What's the situation in verse 8?
The king of Aram was at war with Israel.
Okay. Now remember I told you, and we've talked about it, Aram is north of Israel, around Damascus. Israel is a power. Judah's much smaller. Is smaller, maybe even a vassal of Israel. But Israel is a stronger power. Aram is north, and we saw last week Aram and Israel are in constant war. They are in constant war. But remember, as they describe war, it's not unlike what we looked at with David. A lot of the wars are kind of raids. And in fact, it even talks about that here. You've got peoples, less organized countries, and they raid one another all the time. And raid, you go and take what isn't tied down and go home and bring it home. So it's a little different than we think of, wars. They're not moving in to occupy territory unless they're doing it for agricultural reasons. Usually it's raiding. Okay, so this is one, but they're constantly going at one another along their border, which is northern Israel and into Gilead on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so the king of Aram is doing this. What is his plan? What does the king of Aram plan? And Aram and Israel, that's going to be a big deal in these chapters. What is his deal?
He was going to set up a camp at a certain place.
Okay, so what's his plan? What is the king of Aram planning to do? What does he want to accomplish?
He's going to raid Israel.
Okay, he's going to raid Israel. He's going to raid Israel, right? And one of the things that could be a problem if he's raiding Israel is that Israel is going to could stop him. And so what does he want to do to sort of inhibit Israel from stopping him doing this raiding? Okay, well, he's got a camp. He's in Israel, in territory of Israel, right? And if Israel moves towards him, he's in a position where he can deal with whatever Israel organizes, right? And if Israel doesn't know where he is, then he's got a real advantage, right? So it makes the raiding easier if Israel doesn't know where he is. He can trap whatever Israel sets up to fight him. So what happens? So his strategy is he's going to set up maybe even like a trap in Israel to deal with the Israeli forces that are going to, or Israelite forces that are going to stop him. Who enters the story? Elisha. And what does Elisha do in the story?
He warned
He warns who?
King of Israel,
The king of Israel warns him what?
don't go there.
Don't go there. Because the king of Aram has set up a trap for him. So don't go. And the king of Israel doesn't go. And Aram, the king of Aram, sets it up again. And Elisha warns him again, and he doesn't go. So the king of Aram is, how does he react to the fact that the king of Israel isn't falling into this trap?
He's frustrated. He thinks someone within his own camp may be giving details to his plans.
Right. Okay. So does he find out that it's not within his camp?
Yes.
Yes, he does. And in fact, he finds out what is he told?
Man of God.
Man of God. And that's been a title that's been associated with Elisha throughout the story. So he knows Elisha then is doing it. Now it's really interesting. The king of Israel, and this is Joram, and we talked about him last week, is listening to Elisha, right? This man of God. Now, would his father Ahab, would he have been open to listening to him? Probably not, because Ahab worshipped other idols, and particularly Baal, worshipped Baal, and like his wife Jezebel. But remember, in the description of Joram, he was a man that rejected, cleaned out the worship of Baal, but he was still worshiping God in Dan and Bethel. He was still doing what Jeroboam did, not worshiping in Jerusalem, which is where good children of Israel should worship. That's where God dwells. Okay, but he's listening to this man of God, right? And so the king of Aram is irritated. We'll find out is Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, is frustrated. So what does he decide he's going to do?
He wants to find out where he is, where Elisha is.
Okay, so he's going to do what to Elisha?
He sends men out to capture.
He's going to take him out. Yeah, he's going to take him. He's going to silence Elisha, because if the king of Israel isn't getting information from Elijah, then he'll be able to spring his trap and accomplish what he wants to accomplish. So he finds out that Elijah is
In Dothan.
Dothan. Okay, so he finds out Elisha's in Dothan, and so what does he do?
He sent horses and chariots and a strong force there.
Okay, to take now when Elijah finds out. How does Elijah find out that the king of Aram is coming after him?
His servant.
Okay, his servant tells him that we got a problem. We got these chariots and all these men, and they're coming to get you. And how does Elijah respond when his servant says, "Look, we got a problem"?
Don't be afraid.
Okay, don't be afraid. And what does Elisha do after he tells his servant, "Don't be afraid"?
Cries out to God.
Okay, cries out to God. So he approaches God, which shows that Elisha is a man of God. And when he cries out to God, what happens?
He opened his eyes so he could see.
Okay, And he opens the eyes of the servant. And what does the servant see? That evidently Elisha could see. What does the servant see? The reason why Elisha's not afraid. What does the servant end up seeing that Elisha knew was there?
Many chariots and men of their own.
Okay, you got all kinds of chariots, you got a big army. And how are the chariots described?
Chariots of fire.
Okay, chariots of fire. Now, as soon as we see chariots of fire, we know something about this force. What is this force that Elisha can see and now his servant can see?
Same force that carried Elijah.
Right, it's fiery chariot. This was the chariot that took Elijah up, which means this army is what? What is this army that Elisha could see that's going to protect them from the Arameans who are about to attack them?
God's army.
It's God's army, right? Is there to protect him. And what does Elisha? So they're protected, right? The army of Aram is not going to bother them because they're protected. What does Elisha do to again, by asking God, what does he pray to God happens to this army of Aram?
To strike them with blindness.
Okay, to strike them. So they're not going to he's not going to bring down God's army to wipe them out, but to strike them with blindness. And are they blinded?
Yes.
Okay, they're blinded. And what does he end up doing with this army that's now blinded?
Leads them to another city.
He leads them to another city. And what is the other city he leads them to?
Samaria.
Samaria. Now we know Samaria, right? What is Samaria? Because we've heard Samaria before. And we'll hear it again.
It's now the capital of Israel.
It is the capital of Israel. And so he leads this army this blind army into the city of Samaria. Well, why is that really dramatic?
That's where the king and all his...
Yeah, that's where the king is, and the army of Israel is in Samaria, and this blinded army of their arch enemy is being led into the city, right? And so what does the king, because he doesn't take action himself, he asks, what does the king ask if he is now allowed to do with his enemy army in his city blinded?
He asked Elisha if he should kill him.
Yeah, should I then have, in other words, has God given me this army to destroy? Because I can destroy this army right here. And what does Elijah tell the king to do?
Not to kill him.
Not to kill him. Now, the king has every reason to want to kill him, right? But Elijah says no, and what ends up happening?
Gives him a big feast.
He throws him a great big party and
Sends them back.
And I've got to assume they probably can see, or they're just wandering around that he sends them back home. Now, and now this story is, and in fact, how does the story end? Because it doesn't just end with them going home.
They stop raiding.
They stop raiding Israel, which is kind of interesting because in a chapter we're going to see another war between Aram and Israel. So this seems like almost a self-contained story that doesn't necessarily relate because we don't have anything later. Well, we probably shouldn't attack Israel because of what they did, with this. It's like this story is just here that the writer is choosing to include. Now, why? Why is he choosing to include this? What purpose? Because he doesn't then go back to it. What becomes the purpose of this story? Because in the next verse, we got another king organizing an army to attack Israel.
But God's in control.
Okay, we've got God being in control here. Even if this story really doesn't relate very well to what's going to follow, we've got God being in control and God exercising some grace and mercy here. And again, Elisha being the instrument of that. And what makes it interesting is we've got this story, and this writer isn't dumb. He realizes that in verse 24, we're jumping onto a new story that seems to contradict how the last story ended. Because what's happening in 24?
Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, mobilized his entire army, marched up and laid siege to Samaria.
Right, so right after, we're not going to raid them anymore. And I mean, it wasn't even a decision that they changed their mind. It's presented as the Aramean no longer came raiding into the land of Israel. Next verse,
Right back at it.
they're right back at it. Okay, but we don't worry about that because we're not trying to figure out a historical timeline. We're looking at what these stories say about God and how God is working with the people. And we're trying to kind of figure out what the writer is trying to communicate to people who are living long after this, how he's using this history to teach lessons. So we've got Ben-Hadad as king of Aram. Because he's mentioned may show that it's a different story because the king wasn't mentioned before. And he's marching back into Israel. And what does he end up doing when he marches into Israel?
He laid siege.
Okay, he lays siege. Lays siege to what?
Samaria.
Okay, to the city of Samaria. And remember way back we heard that Samaria is built on hills, which is not unusual. You want to build a walled city on a hill because, it makes it harder to take. So Samaria is built on hills. And this is something that ancient people did all the time. Because if you had a city that had high walls that were thick enough, there's no way for them to get into the city. I mean, getting over the wall is really challenging because people on the wall are doing what to you as you're trying to get over it?
Throwing stuff.
Yeah, they're throwing stuff, shooting arrows and throwing rocks and so going down on you. So it's hard to get over the wall. And in fact, one of the things that's really interesting with a city that was known for its wall, Constantinople, even this is later, you might have two walls. You have an outer wall, inner wall. So if you breached the outer wall, now you were trapped because you couldn't tear the wall down. It's too big and too strong. So even if you got over the first wall, you were in the middle between two walls, which put you in a bad place because you couldn't retreat. These people knew what they were doing. So often the best way to destroy a city is to put it under siege. And sieges could last years. They would have cities under siege for years and years. Cities would need to have sources of water because if a siege is going to last 2 years, you better have water, access to water. You'd have cities that had crops grown in the city inside the walls because you had to feed the people somehow. So that's what they're doing. They're putting a siege around the city. Usually that's really bad because you're not able to get anything from the outside, and that's what's happening in Samaria. And the writer tells us how bad it is. What is his example of how horrible the siege is for the people inside of Samaria?
There was no food. They had used all their food, and the head of a donkey
is worth
a lot of
a whole bunch of money, and even bird droppings. They're selling that. So they're selling anything. Now remember last week when we talked about Edom, when they attacked Edom, and Moab, when they were attacking Moab, and the king of Moab sacrificed his son to the gods, to their god Moloch, to break this siege that Israel. Well, sieges are bad, man. You do anything, because as we see further in this story, if you're not sacrificing your son to God, you're doing, maybe having to do something else. And what's the situation as the king is, sort of inspecting, going through his city. Who confronts him?
A woman is crying out because she's her son's situation.
Okay, woman approaches him, cries out because of the situation. And what is the situation that the woman offers the king?
She said that another woman had a deal with it, that eat her child. And
Okay.
then the next day,
That there's a deal that she made with another mother, and that one day they would eat her child, and then the next day they'd eat the other woman's child. And evidently, they already did the first one. And so what is the problem?
The second lady reneged
Re-
in
re-
her son.
Reneged. And that's, now, as you read this kind of reminds us of another story that we've seen earlier. And I don't think it's an accident that there seems to be some allusions that I think the writer is intentionally calling up. What other story did we see that is not identical by any means, but sort of similar?
Was it not Solomon?
Okay, the story of
baby.
the story of Solomon and the baby, and the woman,
Switched them.
switched. One woman's son, baby died, and she's claiming the other. And Solomon shows this wisdom, and that becomes this example to the world and the writer to his audience of how smart and wise Solomon is. I think we've got like a parallel story here, but this is really dark. That the king is in the position where she's really approaching him to show wisdom, but this is a horrible story. And does the king recognize that this is a horrible story?
Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, when he hears what's happening in his kingdom, what's happening in the city, what does he end up doing?
Tearing his clothes.
Okay, he tears his clothes. And this is, since he's on the wall, the people in the city see this, right? And what is he wearing underneath as he tears his robes, his royal robes? What's he wearing underneath? Sackcloth. And why is that significant that he's wearing sackcloth? What is sackcloth is associated with what? Mourning, that's it. So the people see this king who may be trying to present, as positive a face as can be. They find out that really underneath this facade, he's really mourning too. And what does this horrible, horrible story, and he doesn't make any judgment here, because this is almost beyond making a judgment. What does he conclude? Who does he seem to blame?
Elijah.
He seems to blame Elisha for what's happening in his city of Samaria. And what does he decide he's going to do?
He wants to have him murdered.
Okay, he's going to take Elijah out, which is the same thing the king of Aram wanted to do with Elijah. So he's going to send people to take out Elisha. Okay, and where is Elisha?
He was sitting in his house.
Okay, he's in his house.
His elders are sitting with him.
Okay, and what is the concern? What do they feel in the house? How do they approach Elisha?
Well, the king sent a messenger ahead, but before he arrived, Elisha said to the elders, "Don't you see how this murderer is sending someone to cut off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold it shut against him." is not the sound of his master's footsteps behind him.
Okay. And so Elisha is aware that the king is going to kill him. Well, who shows up, which is a little different, because we end up with a conversation between Elisha and the king, right? Because the king is all of a sudden is there, right? And has a conversation. And who does the king really seem to blame?
The Lord.
Okay, he's blaming the Lord. Now, again, this king of Israel seems to have some sense of the Lord. And remember, that's what I said before. One of the problems that Israel was going to face is if the Lord dwells in Jerusalem, the only way to worship the Lord is where he dwells, but you can't do that if you're in another country. So he set up places where his people can worship the Lord without going to Jerusalem, and that was the calves that he put in Dan and Bethel. And so this king is worshiping what he thinks is the Lord, but according to the writer, he's not, because if he were going to do that, he'd have to do it in Jerusalem, because that's where the Lord dwells. So he's still worshiping a false god. Okay, so the king, though, he really knows that God is in control. Therefore, he's going to blame the Lord for what's happening in his city, Samaria. And how does Elisha respond? How does Elisha respond to the king who is blaming the Lord for the problems he's facing in his city of Samaria?
He lets him know that if the Lord wanted that to end, it can and will end.
Okay, which is reinforcing the idea that God's in control. This is not just random things happening. God is in control. And in fact, when is the reversal going to occur? When will this reversal happen? Because right now we know the head of a donkey costs 80 shekels of silver, right? When will things change? Tomorrow things are going to change. Will the change be dramatic? Yeah, boy. In fact, remember that donkey head that cost 80 shekels of silver? What's going to be the situation tomorrow?
Finest flour will sell for pennies.
Lord have mercy, you're going to be able to get anything you want for almost nothing. When is that going to happen? Tomorrow. Now, you got an army besieging a city. Sieges are broken, but they aren't broken in 24 hours. It's hard to break a siege. Often, and we're going to see this later, when the Assyrians besiege Jerusalem. They're going to, which sometimes happens, a plague will go through an army. And then the army has to withdraw because they've lost too many men, and they're not able to give, because it's hard to lay siege, because you got to get food, so it becomes difficult. So it does, but sieges take a long time to break, just like sieges take a long time to accomplish what they want. It doesn't happen in a day. And who hears Elisha say this? That in a day, boom, we're going to go from expensive donkey heads to the best flour around. Who hears him say that?
An officer.
An officer, and the officer responds,
Couldn't happen.
Can't happen. Cannot happen. In fact, he says, which is, I think, not unintentional. What does he say? What does the captain say? Which actually shows that the captain is aware of God, right? He has someone. What does he say?
If the Lord opens up the floodgates, can it happen?
It's not going to happen. It's going to take a while for the Arameans to pack up their army and go home. It isn't going to happen in a day.
So are we talking about the same God in the sense that you had mentioned the king is maybe worshiping false idols because he's not in
Right.
Judah, and his officer is his officer.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about the Lord, and then in between Elisha's talking about the Lord,
Right.
but we know the God that Elisha was referring to.
Right.
So is there two different gods in play here?
Actually, I don't think so. I think that the problem is going to be with yes and no. Yes, in that, yes, two gods in that the king of Israel is not worshiping the Lord the way you're supposed to worship the Lord. Therefore, what he is worshiping is a false image of the true Lord.
So to solve this problem, Israel would have to make up with Judah, and they would have to go back to Jerusalem.
Yes, to solve, for the writer of this story, and the writer of this story is writing this because we're going to see the fall of Israel in the story. So he isn't writing, he's writing later to people who are living in Judah. So because we're going to see the fall of Israel. There's one way to worship the Lord, and that's in Jerusalem. Therefore, if you're worshiping the Lord anywhere else, if you're performing sacrifices anywhere other than Jerusalem, you're doing what?
Idolatry.
Yeah, you're doing idolatry. You're worshiping a false god. Now, even the writer says that's bad, but it's not as bad as worshiping Baal. It's not as bad as worshiping Baal. That's a whole nother deity that belongs to a whole nother people. That's really bad. This is bad, but not quite as bad. So is it the same God? Well, kind of from our perspective, it would be. But from the writer's perspective, it's you're not doing it in the right way, which means you're worshiping something else. And that's why he talks about the bulls, way back with Jeroboam, that as a sign of this God, as a representation of God, that he made a bull, these calves. And so the writer can associate the worship, even though they're worshiping those four Hebrew letters that aren't to be pronounced. So they see it as the God of Israel, but the people of Judah do not. And certainly the writer does not see it as the same.
So in retrospect, the only way this would have been solved would have been for these people the realization that they were worshiping, that they had to get to Jerusalem to worship the one true God. Right.
That would be the only way Israel can worship the way they're supposed to worship. But not only worship in Israel, but also do what? So it wouldn't be just worshiping, they couldn't be two separate countries they came. They wouldn't be able to do that.
They would have to unite.
So they'd have to unite under who? Or whom?
God.
Well, ultimately under God, but who would be God's? What is God? There you go. You'd have to come together under the Davidic dynasty, which means, and if Judah is a vassal state to Israel, because Israel is really the stronger of the two, because the land is better, population is bigger. They're 10 tribes, Judah's 2. Israel is going to have to say, we're going to erase everything that has happened since Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and go back to, we're going to accept the little bitty king of Judah, who is a vassal to our king. I'm going to give up my throne and accept the king of little bitty Judah as my authority, and now I can worship God in Jerusalem. That's not going to happen. And as the writer writes it, it's almost like he knows this came, and this is part of what God has planned, because we're going to see God working with Israel, ends up working not to bring them glory, but to bring them down. And that's going to teach a lesson to the people of Judah. So the writer's seeing God being involved in this. And Israel's going to suffer the consequences of turning away from God, which they almost have to do if they're going to be an independent country. That's why looking at it politically and even theologically is tricky, because you've got to get into how the writer sees this, not what's actually happening on the ground. I don't think there would be any question if historically you went back and asked this Joram, who will you worship? He'd say the Lord God of Israel. We worship the Lord God. Well, what about the people in Judah? He'd say, well, they're not. They're not worshiping correctly, because if they were, they'd be offering sacrifices in Bethel and Dan. That's the way you worship the Lord God. They're wrong. And the writer says, no, you're wrong. And so it gets a little confusing, mainly because we worship God. We can worship God in a lot of different places. We're not limited. We don't have national gods, but they do. Gods protect nations and such. So, does that make any sense? Because I'm just sort of thinking out. I'm riffing now. I haven't thought it through. I'm kind of okay. So anyway, we've got the bottom line is the siege is going to be broken, right? And not only is it going to be broken, but food is going to be really cheap. Talk about inflation. This is radical deflation. You're going to have all the food you want, and it's not going to cost any. And the captain says, this is the dumbest thing I've heard. That just doesn't happen. And Elisha says, well,
you're going to see it with your own eyes, but you're not going to eat it.
Yeah. This is, you're going to see it with your own eyes, but you're not going to eat any of that cheap food. And we'll find out later why. All right, so we've got this siege. Now, the writer shifts our focus. And where does he shift our focus in verse 3?
There were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate.
Okay. Now, leprosy, we've talked about leprosy before. What's the problem with leprosy?
Unclean.
Okay, it's not just a physical problem, it's a spiritual problem. You're unclean. And these 4 lepers who are at the city gates, they have a dilemma, right? They're sitting at the city gates. They can't go in the city. What is their dilemma?
They're going to die.
One way or another, they're going to die. Because feeding lepers is not anybody's high priority. And you got a famine inside the city, right? So what do the lepers decide? These 4 lepers decide.
To go over to the camp of the Arameans and surrender.
Okay, we're going to surrender. Now, even before when we see 4 lepers, these are not going to be heroes in the story. If there were 3 of them, then we might say, ooh, that's a perfect number. 3, they may play a godly role. But 4, they ain't going to play a godly role in this. 4 is an earthly number. So these 4 lepers are probably not going to play a real positive, godlike role. They're not going to be his instruments in this. So, and that's kind of important because, leprosy is contagious, going into the enemy camp, when you look at that, you say, oh, well, maybe they're going to infect the Arameans and they're going to get sick and die. But that's not what's going to happen. So what ends up happening? They decide because if we go in the city, they're starving. If we stay here, we're going to starve. So why not go to the camp of the Arameans? And the worst they can do is what?
Kill them.
Kill them. That's the worst. And that's probably what they're going to do to 4 lepers is show up. They're probably not going to invite them to dinner. But have we lost anything? Heck no. It'll be quick. So they go into the camp, and what do they find when they go into the camp?
No one was there.
Nobody is there. No, nobody is there. But what is there? Everything. So it's like they
fled.
Yeah. And the writer tells us what happened. Now that the lepers don't know. What does the writer tell us happened in the Aramean camp?
They saw the chariots.
This army of God. They saw, heard it. And what do they assume? When they hear these chariots and soldiers rattling their armor and getting their spears and stuff, what do they assume? Because they don't assume that they're going to be fighting the army of God. What do they assume?
The king of Israel hired the Hittite and Egyptian kings to attack them.
Okay, the Hittites are another peoples in the area. Now the Hittites that was a group you really were afraid of, because the Hittites were the first people to start making weapons out of iron, as opposed to bronze. And bronze is softer, better than nothing, but it's a little soft. Iron isn't. And the Hittites talk of, when you read the ancient writings, Hittites had chariots of iron, which made them the military power in the area. So hiring Hittites, a Hittite army, that's a big deal. They're gonna whoop you. And hiring the Egyptians, again, regional power, major power, mercenary troops. So they assume that Israel has paid off these two powers, and that's what they're hearing. So the Arameans do what?
Flee.
They end up fleeing and leaving everything they've got behind. And here are these 4 lepers in the Aramean camp. And what do these 4 lepers do?
Took the silver.
They go into, and it's interesting because they go into a tent and they say, ooh, silver, new clothes. So they take, and maybe even better than that,
They had food and drink.
they have food and drink, so they eat, and they take the silver, and they take the new clothes, and they do what with it?
They hid them.
They go and hide it. And this is just one tent. And so they say, well, we got a lot of tents here. So they go to another one. But when they do that, what do they start thinking about as they're going to move to tent 2?
They're not doing it right.
Yeah, they're not doing what's right. And what do they realize?
It was a day of good news and they're keeping it to themselves.
And so who should hear about this? That the camp is empty?
Okay.
Yeah, the king, the people in Samaria should find out that the army that's besieging them, because if they don't find out, they're going to continue to eat donkey head, right? So maybe we should tell them. And what happens when the people in the city hear that the Arameans are gone? What do the people in the city do when they hear the army of the Arameans that the army's gone, but all their stuff is left behind? What do the people inside the city do?
Weren't they afraid if they went out that they would be attacked? It was a ploy.
Well, that's what the king is thinking, that maybe the Aramean army has gone into the desert and he's done this, and when they come out, they're going to attack. And so what do they end up doing?
They sent out some men.
Okay, they sent out some men to the camp, right? And the men find out,
Exactly what the lepers.
yeah, the lepers were right. And once they find out that the leper's right, and they left in haste, and they come back and tell the king, what do the people in the city do?
They plundered it.
Well, have you ever seen like on the news on Black Friday, when they have these sales at the mall, and people, they open the door to Kmart or Walmart, and people just flood through? That's what the people in Samaria do when they hear the camp is deserted. They flood through the gates, because they've been eating bird poop. Yeah. So they're hot diggity dog. This is good stuff. And in fact, it's really good stuff. Now there's so much of it you can buy. What's choice grain going for now? You can get a whole bunch of good grain for a shekel. Ooh, that sounds like what Elisha said. Ooh, because all of this grain, all of this, the supplies for this army, now in the hands of Samaria. Well, what about this poor captain?
He got trampled.
He was the guy at the door to Walmart, keeping the crowds. He was the one that opened it at 5 a.m. And the people who were looking for the discount television did what to him? Trampled him. So he is now...
And that's why it was said he would see it, but not...
Yeah, he would not eat any of it because he's been trampled. Again, here we've got a story thrown in here. Don't go back to it. Why? What is this showing?
Having faith in God.
Okay, we've got...
God's in control.
Again, we got faith in a God who is in complete control. Let's move as because I'm the one that's because I find these stories kind of interesting. In chapter 8, what do we have right at the beginning of chapter 8?
The Shunammite's lands restored.
Well, we meet somebody that we've seen before.
The woman.
Okay, the woman whose son was healed. And what's the situation that is about to take place in the land?
A famine.
Okay, we've got a famine. How many years?
7.
7, of course, 7. Got to be 7 years. And what does this woman whose son was healed by Elisha, what does she decide to do?
She followed his instructions, what
Okay.
the man of God said.
And what does he tell her to do?
To go away.
Okay, to go away.
Philistines.
Okay, which is along the coast. So she's going to go get out of Israel because we've got a famine here. And so she's there 7 years. After the famine is over, what does she do?
Went back.
She goes back, and what does she want when she goes back?
She house
and land.
Yeah, she wants the land she left behind, right? Well, is that a problem? Getting her land back? When she returns? To whom does she have to go to get her land back?
King.
Got to go to the king. And what is the king doing when she gets back? Which is kind of interesting.
Talking to Gehazi.
Talking to Gehazi. Now we've seen him before, Gehazi, and what do we know about Gehazi?
He's a leper now.
Well, he's a leper, but we don't seem to. This fellow isn't mentioned here, which means we got that independent story with Naaman and stuff.
Could it just be a matter of timing?
Could be. We're talking, and we see something very similar in the Gospels. We've got it's almost, you almost have to envision this writer sitting at a desk with little scraps of paper, big pile of scraps of paper of stories. And what this writer is doing is he's taking this pile of stories and he is putting the stories into a narrative. And the stories don't necessarily connect. We saw, one doesn't connect at all. Where it says, we're not going to attack anymore. We're not going to raid anymore. Next verse, the king is organizing an army to attack. So we've got these independent stories that the writer is trying to organize. And the stories aren't necessarily always linked, although the characters are the same. Whether this is happening earlier in a historical narrative or whether it's this particular story doesn't have anything about Naaman because he's not mentioned, don't know. But Gehazi is there, and what is his role in this? Because he plays an important role, whether he's a leper or not. What role does he play? Why is the king Joram? What is Joram doing with Gehazi? Why is he talking to him? Which is really very interesting.
He knows he's a servant.
Knows he's a servant of Elisha, and why? And I love this. Why is he talking to him? What does he ask Gehazi?
He wants him to tell how Elisha restored the dead the dead to life, the woman whose son Elisha has brought back to life, to beg the king for her house and land.
What-
So he's telling what happened before.
Just in,
Yeah, why is Gehazi talking? Why is the king called Gehazi to talk with him?
he wants to know the great things.
He wants to know. So the king is, with respect to Elisha, is like a fan. You know, because he wants Gehazi to tell him, tell me more. Elisha did this? Oh wow, tell me more. You know, this king is like a fan of Elisha. He wants to hear. And one of the stories that Gehazi says is about this woman whose son Elijah brought back to life, and she is here, and what ends up happening? And she wants her land restored. Oh, by the way, the woman's, sitting outside your office. Elijah, let me tell you, Elijah brought her son back to life. And the king does what?
Gives her
Everything.
After, tell me about it, I'm sure. Tell me about Elisha. What is he like? Gives her back the land, right? So she ends up getting all the revenue she deserves. Now, again, why is this story here? Because we don't go back to it. It's just here. Why would the writer include this? What do you think may be his purpose? What do you think? Why would this story be here? We've got these little isolated stories that don't necessarily connect except in terms of characters. Why is it? And you said before in the other stories, it's focused on, the control, the glory of God. What is the purpose? What might this story, which really doesn't have to do with God,
Even the king is aware.
even king is aware of
the glory of God.
the glory of God as shown through
Elisha.
Elisha. So this is almost an Elisha story, sort of reinforcing that. Now, all of these little stories, like I said, are independent, although kind of cool. Focused on, if you take them together, we've got God is in control, and his messenger is, or his instrument is, Elisha. Now we get back to the narrative. Now we get back to where we need to be. Because remember, we still have two things, assignments to Elijah that haven't been fulfilled yet. What happens right after the deal with the woman? What happens in verse 7? Because we've got Elisha again. And where does Elisha go?
Damascus.
He goes to Damascus. And who was there in Damascus?
Ben-Hadad.
Ben-Hadad. And he's the king. And what's his problem?
He was ill.
He's ill. Now what does the king do?
He sends God
Yeah.
gifts to him and is instructing him to ask him whether he will get better.
Okay. And who does he send? Who does Ben-Hadad send?
Hazael.
Hazael. Again, that L at the end. To check out if he's going to get better. Now, what happens when Hazael meets Elisha? And he meets him how? How does he approach Elisha?
He took him gifts.
He's got all kinds of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what does Ben-Hadad want to know?
He'll recover from his
Okay.
illness.
And what does Elisha say?
He will die.
Okay, that you tell him
But tell him
that he's going to recover, but in reality, he's going to die. Now, as soon as we see Hazael, we know what? As soon as we see Hazael, we know what about him?
He's from the Lord.
Well, Hazael. Well, we know the name
The name.
has name in it. What else do we know about it? We know something really important about Hazael as soon as we see the name.
We're assuming that he'll be the next king.
We know in fact, we're not going to assume,
How do we know that?
because how do we know that? Remember, Elijah was assigned to do
Anoint.
Anoint them.
3 things.
Is he
going
named then?
That's who he's going to anoint. And he's named. You're going to anoint Hazael. You're going to anoint Hazael as king of Aram. And as soon as he shows up, we, the reader, know this guy's going to be king. This guy's going to be king. So there's no mystery in here, because the writer's already told us that this is what's going to happen. And Elisha, and this is kind of it's an odd little story. Elisha says, now, tell the king that he's going to get better, but I'm going to let you know he's not. And then what happens? After he tells Hazael that the king, Ben-Hadad, is going to die, what does Elisha end up doing?
Tells him what he will do.
Okay, what he's going to do. And what is he going to do?
Rise up against and kill.
He's
He
going
will harm the Israelites.
He is going to be, he's going to do horrible things to the Israelites. Which in essence, he's telling Hazael what?
He's going to be king.
He's going to be king. That he's going to do horrible things to the Israelites. So Elisha's gone, Hazael goes back to Ben-Hadad, and what does he say to Ben-Hadad?
He told him that Elijah said he would certainly recover.
Which is exactly what Elijah told him to do. And then what does Hazael do?
He took a thick cloth.
He murders the king. He murders the king. So, part 2 of that checklist has been accomplished. We got Elisha, we've got Hazael, now king. What is the only one left? The only thing left? Jehu is the only thing left. But we know that's going to happen. Now, verse 16, we go, because this is what the writer does. What is he doing in verse 16? Because we've been focused on Israel, right? We've got a shift. Where does it shift?
Judah.
Okay, now we go back to Judah, and this is what the writer has done. Reference the 2 kings. And what happens in Judah?
Jehoram.
Okay, Jehoram becomes king because Jehoshaphat is dead. So his son becomes king. And as the writer always does, tells us about, because this is what's most important. It's not whether the kingdom is prosperous, because that's going to follow if the king is if the king follows in the way of the Lord. And what does he tell about Jehoram?
He followed in the ways of the kings of Israel.
Yeah, he follows in the ways of the kings of Israel, in particular Ahab, which means he's doing what?
Evil in the eyes of the Lord.
Evil in the eyes of the Lord. He's worshiping Baal. Why doesn't God? Because God, when God punishes the kings of Israel, it's because they're not worshiping. They do evil in the sight of the Lord. Why doesn't he kill Jehoram? Why doesn't he take Jehoram out and get somebody new?
Because of the promise he made to David.
Promise he made to David. But the writer wants to make sure we know there are consequences to doing evil in the sight of the Lord. And what is the consequence? So even though God doesn't take him out, what is the consequence for Jehoram, king of Judah?
Something will happen that he will be killed.
Well, something's going to happen. Something happens almost immediately to him. Edom rebels. Because remember, it said that Israel is the stronger, and Edom is one of the vassal states. Not only of Israel, we're going to see that Judah because Judah's going to march against Aram. But Edom rebels, and are they still rebelling?
To this day.
Yeah, they're rebelling to this day. So there are consequences even in that. You know, you do evil in the sight of God, you pay consequences. And what happens to Jehoram? He dies, as all people do. And if you want to know more about him, yeah, go look at the books of the annals of the kings of Israel, of Judah. And who becomes king after him?
His son.
Yeah, his son Ahaziah. And Ahaziah's, his grandmother is Jezebel. So how long is he going to reign?
No.
Yeah, he's not going to
do
reign.
evil in the eyes of the Lord.
Yeah, he's going to do evil in the eyes of the grandmother of his wife, or his mother. Yeah, his mother. And so he's walking in the ways of Ahab, so he isn't good. Now, and we'll finish this, we'll start just this first verse, and then we'll kind of go into it next week. At the end of chapter 8, verse 28, what is about to occur?
He went war against Hazael, king of Aram.
Okay, so Ahaziel, king of Aram, is at war with Israel again. And who joins forces with Joram? Who is the king of Israel? Still the son of Ahab, is still king of Israel. Who joins forces with him to fight Aram?
Hazael, the king of Judah.
King of Judah. So we've got Judah, and again, shows Judah's status, that they're fighting a war that they have no interest in. This is a war that's going to benefit Israel. So they're joining forces. They are about to fight. What ends up happening to Joram?
He's been wounded.
He's wounded, and he goes back to Jezreel, that's a city, and goes back to recover from his wounds. Okay, we'll look at next week, starting there, we'll look at chapter 9 through 12:21, and we're going to be looking at 2 kings, because Elisha is going to recede, and we're going to focus on, we still got Jehu, has not been introduced into the story yet. And we'll look at him. We're going to also look at Joash. And Joash is going to be really, really important for Judah. Because remember, Judah's king, the quality of their kings kind of go up and down. And so some are good and some are bad. And Joash is going to be good. He's going to be a good one. So, any questions with this? These are, stories that are sort of almost random stories, but I think they make the point that we've got God being in charge and we've got Elisha being his instrument. So, take them for what they're worth. Any questions about what's going on in this section? Okay, let's have a word of prayer then. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. Continue to bless us. Remind us that you are in charge always, always, always. And help us to trust in that. Help us to find peace in that. But also help us to realize that our behaviors do have consequences. Although they don't change your love for us, we certainly pay consequences for our actions. So remind us of that as well. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. So thank you.